Hello, my name is Greta Goldenman. I'm an environmental lawyer specializing in international law, and I'd like to brief you on a report that I recently helped to prepare for a group of Nordic organizations working for nature conservation and sustainable development. It's a long title, Investigation of Legally Binding Elements in Support of the Global Post-2020 Framework for Chemicals and Waste. But it's a short report, and I hope you will take a look at it after this introduction. As you know, SciChem, the Strategic Approach to International Chemicals Management, comes to an end next year in 2020. SciChem has had an ambitious goal to achieve the sound management of chemicals throughout their life cycle so that by 2020, chemicals are used and produced in ways that minimize significant adverse effects on human health and the environment. We all know that this goal will not be achieved, but it remains just as relevant beyond 2020. According to the World Health Organization, at least 1.6 million people die each year due to chemicals exposure. And at the same time, it's been predicted by the second Global Chemicals Outlook prepared by UNEP that the overall production of chemicals will double between 2017 and 2030. If we do not take serious action to reduce the production and use of hazardous substances, the number of persons who die each year due to chemical exposure will also increase. SciChem is a voluntary regime. From the beginning, it recognized that the legally binding conventions in place for managing chemicals and toxic waste left some big gaps globally. The Montreal Protocol, the Basel Convention, the Rotterdam Convention on the PIC procedure, the Stockholm Convention on POPs, and the Minamata Convention on mercury. These conventions still need our continued support and implementation as part of the work with the successor to SciChem. However, they cover less than 200 of the tens of thousands of toxic chemicals in international trade. In many ways, SciChem has been a positive experience. It has provided a way for governments, civil society, international organizations, and industry to come together to discuss important issues related to toxic chemicals, but it did not deliver on its goal as expected. 12 years later, it is clear that SciChem's voluntary approach has not been enough to manage the problems caused by highly toxic chemicals in international trade. Under SciChem, there's no clear obligation that governments must have chemicals management systems and legislation in place. There's no way to monitor and evaluate what countries are actually doing to manage chemicals safely. There's no way to take focused and harmonized actions globally on substances of global concern, the chemicals that we are now all exposed to because of global trade, such as the highly hazardous pesticides used in industrial agriculture, or the endocrine substances used in plastic manufacture, the extremely persistent fluorinated substances, or PFAS, and a number of other problematic chemicals that are not covered by existing conventions, but are found in many consumer goods. And finally, there are not enough financial resources for governments to manage chemicals within their borders globally. Our study explains why the post-2020 global regime for chemicals and waste needs to have at least some legally binding elements. We believe strongly that a legally binding framework would help achieve the SciChem goals and provide sustainable funding options for national governments to use for financing chemicals management. We are proposing a hybrid approach, a mix of legally binding obligations for certain elements, along with some flexible elements. Drawing upon experience from the Paris Agreement on Global Climate Change, some flexibility in setting national objectives and approaches could be allowed for some of the legally binding elements. We propose 4 legally binding elements at a minimum. First, an obligation that all countries have adequate legislation in place for ensuring chemical safety, including national action plans for reducing risks from chemicals within their borders. Second, a review system similar to that in place under the UN Human Rights Commission, in which a country's national chemicals management efforts are reviewed by other governments to shed light on the progress that they are making. Third, an obligation on all countries to take measures, such as restrictions or bans, to reduce risks from chemicals considered to be of global concern, to be based on clear criteria to be agreed upon. Chemicals of global concern would include highly hazardous pesticides and highly toxic and persistent substances not covered by existing conventions and with global distribution in consumer goods. The presence of such substances is an obstacle that hampers the full potential for a circular economy that is an important strategy for reaching a number of targets for the Sustainable Development Goals. Chemicals of global concern expose workers, consumers, and the environment in ways that are not reflected in the criteria for existing conventions. For example, today's multinational supply chains for products and associated material waste streams may cause widespread human and environmental exposure to various hazardous chemicals. And finally, we believe there should be the obligation of transparency. Producers of chemicals and product manufacturers should be required to disclose information whenever chemicals hazardous to health and the environment are used in products and present in waste streams, at a minimum for the chemicals of global concern. These elements are not new to SciChem. Indeed, they are drawn from the 11 elements agreed at the ICCM4 in the SciChem Overall Orientation and Guidance document. But unless they become legally binding, it will be too easy for countries to delay setting them in place. The good news is that these 4 legally binding elements, if put in place at national level, will help governments, especially low and medium income countries, to get more resources for the safe management of chemicals and waste. They will help governments to define industry responsibility for chemical harm, to set up comprehensive cost recovery policies and systems, and include the sound management of chemicals and waste in national development plans and budgeting processes, which will be very important for getting more donor support. These legally binding elements will especially help governments of low and medium countries to open up new sustainable sources of revenue. It is a win-win situation for governments as well as citizens. So I hope you will join us in calling for the post-2020 regime to include at least these 4 legally binding elements for managing highly toxic chemicals in global trade, and in securing that the successor to SciChem delivers on its overarching goal. Thank you.